Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see folks that we've seen before, new folks. Welcome, welcome. While you're joining us, feel free to share in the chat where you're zooming in from. If you want to share your land acknowledgement in the chat. If you don't know what that is, we've got thank you. Yep. I am zooming in from the land of the Muwekma Ohlone people, also known as the Temian Nation of Santa Clara County. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited. Thank you so much for joining us during what may be your noon lunch hour or beyond. I know Will is joining us from London, so that's much further afield than
We just had dinner hour.
It's very civilized, Will.
Excellent. Oh, wow. All right. All right, Jean from West Yorkshire, Bingley, West Yorkshire, UK. Excellent.
Represent
Welcome,
UK,
welcome.
thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for our Let's Talk About. We have recordings. Dan tends to talk with folks from all over. Will is a favorite on our channel. We love talking to Dr. Will Tosh. We have past conversations that are recorded on our website, sfshakes.org/community. Let's talk about it. It's also on our YouTube channel. We've last spoken to Will about Let's As You Like It before. You can check out our past recordings, sign up for new ones. We have more coming up because soon we're rounding the bend into our third week of rehearsal, and we'll be into tech for The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And that is our free Shakespeare in the Park. We go to 4 locations. Check out our schedule online. And our next 2 Let's Talk About It will be focused on The Two Gentlemen of Verona. We will be talking with our director, Eli Sunny Orquiza, as well as 4 members of the Two Gents cast. In fact, we will be talking with the 2 gents and the 2 ladies from The Two Gentlemen of Verona. And without further ado, I know we're still getting folks in. So glad to have you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Will Tosh here to talk about the play, and as well as SF Shakes board member Dan Rabinowitz. We have bios for both of those folks. Will is the director of education at the Globe Theater. Not the one in California, but the actual one in London, not to be confused. And I also want to say a huge congratulations to Will for the praise and accolades garnered by his latest book, because there's others, Straight Acting: The Hidden Queer Lives of William Shakespeare. And we have a link on it if y'all are interested. So excited to have you back. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Dan and Will.
Terrific. Carla, thank you very much. And Will, as always, an old and cherished friend and a valued member of our San Francisco Shakespeare intellectual community, which stretches from San Francisco to London and points beyond as well. So I hope everybody enjoyed listening to the George Shearing choral treatment of Who is Sylvia, which is one of Shakespeare's, perhaps the earliest of Shakespeare's really great songs, and has been set to music by Franz Schubert, by Gerard Finzi, by Johansson, by George Shearing, and in rock music by Galt McDermott as well. And this summer, you will hear a wonderful setting of Who is Sylvia by our own Jen Coogan for our production here. And for those of you who are true Shakespeare nerds, which is basically just about everybody who's logged on here, one of the things that I've always enjoyed about Who is Sylvia is it is the basis for the meet cute scene in Shakespeare in Love, where Gwyneth Paltrow comes in to audition and Joe Fiennes is prostrate on a bench in the Globe, stupefied with boredom, listening to people quote Marlowe for their auditions. And Paltrow comes up and starts quoting Who is Sylvia? She doesn't sing it, but she actually quotes it, and Fiennes wakes up and thereby hangs the rest of the tale. So we thought you would enjoy we thought you might enjoy hearing the treatment of it, and that it would pique everybody's interest about the way in which our own composer as almost composer in residence, Jen Coogan, will do for Who is Sylvia in our forthcoming production. So without further ado, I thought we would jump in with a couple of thoughts, and then Will and I will do our usual sort of back and forth riffing off each other about this. It's a very early play. It may even be the first. It is clearly a play of a brilliantly talented but not fully developed theatrical talent. And what has always been interesting to me about this are sort of two things. One of which is that we see in this play 3 or 4 different ideas emerging, which we know Shakespeare will explore at vastly greater depth and sensitivity later on. We see the self-conscious villain in Proteus's discussions about what he is doing, which we will see later on in so many contexts: Edmund, Iago, Richard III, lots of Macbeth in some respects. We see the idea of women finding agency by cross-dressing as men and acting out the things they need to do in their own lives but can't do as women. And we see that in so many later plays in such a deeper way. We see the contrast between the social freedom of life in the forest and the rigorous strictures of courtly life. And then of course we actually come to the nub of the issue, which I'm going to then kick over to Will, which is Arthur Quiller Couch's wonderful comment about this play, which is actually one of the greatest critical synopses, in which he said, well, the thing about Two Gentlemen of Verona is there are no gentlemen in Verona in this play. Neither the dunce nor the knave can really be classified as gentlemen. So one of the unusual and wonderful things about Will's job, and one of the things that Will does just brilliantly, and I know this from personal engagement and observation, is bringing scholarship to bear and deep learning in both Shakespeare and the Elizabethan literary context to bear on each of our successive Globe productions. So Will, I think where I would start our discussion today is by saying, so assuming that you were sitting down to talk to the director and the actors of a new production of Two Gentlemen of Verona, where would you start in talking about this play? What?
Well, Dan, thank you for that, and thank you, Carla, for that lovely introduction earlier as well. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and nice to be joining you in your midday noontime break from London. But those are such great ideas, Dan. I was jotting things down like a maniac there, because I wanted to catch all of that. And I mean, I was thinking about a sort of dramaturgical approach, sort of research dramaturgical approach to this play, and I'm actually quite envious of SF Shakes, because we haven't done it as a main house production at the Globe since 1996.
Wow.
So that's a long. It was the very first production on the Globe stage in its more or less completed form. So it was actually a year before the grand opening, but it was a kind of a very abbreviated summer season in 1996 called the prologue season. And it was the first full length, full run production, first one to be reviewed by the national press. And it was,
Will,
it was
do you have
sorry, Dan.
do you have a sense of why Mark Rylance chose it? Is there sort of Globe lore about why he began with Two Gents?
So I think the Globe lore is because it is understood to be a very early, if not the first play. So I think he was feeling quite Genesisian, if that isn't the word at all, but you know what I mean. Like he was feeling very, this is the launch. I mean, it was also not written for the Globe, as I'm sure lots of people will know. It's earlier than the Globe as a building. But right. I think Mark Rylance's feeling was sort of, you know, we start with a very early piece. But it really surprised people because they didn't do it in a Renaissance style or original practices way. They did it as a modern dress production. So I think lots of people got very kind of thrown into the Globe, saw people in jeans and kind of suits and stuff, and it was a real kind of announcement as well that the Globe was not just a kind of space for historical reenactment, you know, it was a space for working seriously and artistically with the material. So I think today, you know, it would be there would be a lot of choice in terms of how a director, you know, you guys are going to be have been making fabulous choices, I know, in terms of what you'd do with this play. I mean, I suppose I'd pick up that Gwilla Couch thing about, you know, there are no gentlemen in this play, which is absolutely true. But there is a pair of friends and friendship, and the strictures of, you know, Renaissance friendship, early modern friendship, are the thing that is driving some of the weird behavior in this play and some of the problematic behavior. The play isn't excusing that behavior, I hasten to add, but it's giving it a context of how individuals like Valentine and Proteus, who are highly educated, elite young men, been through a certain form of education that really centralizes their relationships with other men. That's the thing that sort of the ethical kind of focus is placed on. And of course, that's, I mean, you know, CF, the book I just published, there's a lot to say about that. But actually, it's not that what the play is saying, I think, is this is quite problematic, because you have two individuals who Shakespeare gives highly symbolic names to. So Valentine is someone who is, you know, we will see, becomes kind of swayed by powerful kind of chivalric romantic feelings. And Proteus is someone who becomes fickle and changeable. You know, so we're given these individuals who should be friends with each other and should behave in, you know, gentlemanlike ways, to use a Gwilla Crouch phrase, but don't. They get friendship really wrong.
You know, it's interesting because the play almost sets up this kind of duality of conception of what love might be. And it's very clear that the relationship between Proteus and Valentine is a love relationship in some important sense of that word. And I think you're absolutely right, Will, that it's by far the most important driver of what's going on the stage is that relationship. But in parallel, you know, there is this relationship with Julia and Sylvia, which is,
Yeah.
which is almost, Valentine almost sort of reminds one of Romeo before he meets Juliet. They're
Yeah, of course. And I think, as well as, look, you've got Proteus and Valentine, you have Proteus and Julia, and Valentine and Sylvia, and then Proteus and Sylvia and Eglamour. You've got Lance and Speed.
yes,
You've got Lance and Crab. And all of, and you've got Julia and Viola, Lucetta. You've got all of these forms of intimate relationship, lots of which are not very legible to us today. So the intimate relationship between an employer and a servant, or the intimate relationship between two male friends, obviously we know what that is, that's not completely foreign to us, but the precise way that Shakespeare's culture understood that is different and blurs much more into what we'd understand as a kind of queer relationship. And there's a sort of, there's intimate friendship between the two women that emerges. They don't know each other, but they forge a relationship really quite quickly when Julia is dressed as Sebastian. So you've sort of got all of these forms of youthful, intimate relationship that I think the play is sort of holding in actually quite sophisticated balance all the way through. And I'm glad you mentioned Shakespeare in Love, and I'm quite glad actually you drew attention to the moment in that film that rather honors this play with that moment when Gwyneth Paltrow comes out, because most of the film takes great pleasure in kind of knocking Two Gentlemen of Verona down. So if people remember that movie, it's production, it's at least one staging of the play at court that is being presented by the film as a kind of inert, unrealistic, kind of stagey representation of love that sends old Judi Dench playing Queen Elizabeth to sleep, and is the whole film is presenting as the thing from which Romeo and Juliet will spring.
right.
And the thing that Romeo and Juliet springs from the Queen saying to Joseph finds to Shakespeare, you can't show me the kind of truth and power of love, or whatever it is that she says. And he goes, right. He goes away and writes the play. So, and I think quite a lot of, either implicitly or explicitly, quite a lot of kind of commentary on Two Gentlemen of Verona is a bit condescending. It sort of puts it in this is early, this is kind of, Shakespeare sort of working stuff out. And I think that's true. And I think you get lots of repeated themes and kind of sort of scenic units, if that's the right word, that recur in later plays, unquestionably. But I suppose that I'm suggesting that in holding up simultaneously all of these different sorts of relationships in conflict is not an easy thing. That is a highly complex, highly wrought dramatic piece that works. And if it works in a slightly kind of slightly over-engineered, kind of slightly too pat, slightly too, well, it takes a hell of, it takes a, to misquote Dolly Parton, it takes a lot of money to look this cheap. And I think it takes a lot of labor to look effortless, or slightly kind of, or even it takes a lot of labor to look slightly trite, which is what this play does. And so I'm interested in the way actually it's yes, it's an early work, yes, it's a work that finds repetition later in Shakespeare's career, but it's not unsophisticated.
Well,
it's a very complex play.
It's interesting that you say that, Will, because one of the few critics that I've seen, who actually really likes this play and finds it interesting, both dramaturgically for exactly the reasons that you're advancing, this idea of balancing these quite complex set of shifting relationships, really a tour de force on the part of a dramatist as young as Shakespeare was. But Harold Goddard at one point suggests that, which I've always thought was really an interesting comment, Goddard suggests at one point that behind the dramaturgy and behind the construct, this is an extraordinarily sophisticated parody of courtly evolution and of the way in which young men of means and degree conduct themselves, and that in fact it's almost a kind of a trenchant comment by a young man down from Stratford, who in other respects was highly both conscious of, and I think one would have to say relatively respectful of Elizabethan social hierarchies. But there's almost a parodic element in Two Gentlemen, because Valentine and Proteus are so colossally unsuited to the beau ideal of an early Renaissance gentleman.
I buy that. I totally buy that. I think it in a sense, parody or satire is always the easiest thing to misread, isn't it? It's always the easiest thing to, with the drawback of historical distance, to miss the edge. And I suspect we've done that a little bit with this play. And I'm sure people on the call will be interested in the challenges posed by the final scene in this play, where, again, sorry, it seems sort of ridiculous to sort of say like spoilers, you've all read Shakespeare, but like Valentine and Proteus in their sort of combat over Sylvia, it doesn't end well or comfortably for Sylvia, or really any of the women on stage. Proteus takes Sylvia off into the forest and threatens to rape her and makes a move towards her. That's evident in the text. And Valentine, who has been in sort of lying in wait to try and rescue her, jumps out and stops him, turns on him with great vituperation, understandably, chastising him, I mean, implicitly for his attempted assault of Sylvia, but he expresses it almost entirely through the outrage of betrayed friendship.
Right.
And it's that invocation of betrayed friendship that makes Proteus go, oh my God, you're so right. I don't know what I was doing. How could I have done that? At which point Valentine says, well, great that you've succumbed to your senses. You can have her. And
Right.
it's a moment that has caused problems from the instant that this play made it to the stage in the 18th century that we know of, that we have a kind of performance history of. It's squalid, it's horrible, no one likes it. It doesn't, we can't make sense of it. And I think you've really identified an issue with this play, which is I think it is parodying in a kind of fairly grotesque way, actually, let's be honest, but it's parodying principles and sort of almost a mythology around intimate male friendship that sees all things in common between identical and intimate male friends. And there are a series through the medieval period and the early Renaissance, there are a series of exemplary narratives about martial male friends who are so close and share so much that they are happy to share a wife, essentially, or to pass a woman between them in a way that these chivalric narratives try very hard, not wholly successfully, to make that non-grotesque. But it's always presented as a sign of these friends' virtue, that they're able to do that without kind of coming to us.
Oh
So
boy, that is so interesting, Will. And of course it's the thing that is so striking about that scene is Sylvia has nothing to say. No line there. There's literally no more lines for Sylvia after this bizarre event takes place, which I think really does go to this exactly the point that you were making, Will, which is that what was on the dramatist's mind, or what he was presenting there, was in a sense exactly this iteration of this sort of chivalric model of friendship, in which the woman really becomes a cipher, almost a nullity in this sense, and that's just perfectly illustrated by the fact that Sylvia gets no more lines, nothing to say. It's
and Shakespeare comes back to that sort of moment of silent trauma, if you like, in later plays. And Measure for Measure, he does something not dissimilar, where Isabella, who's another assailed character, is presented with a proposition at the end of the play, not in the aggressive way that you get at the end of Two Gents, but a really unexpected sexual proposition, which she greets with silence. And, you know, wordlessness on the page is not the same as no response on stage.
Oh, of course.
So there's, you know, so there's all sorts of things that could be, but it is interesting that that's something that, for whatever reason, Shakespeare finds dramatically powerful as well. I mean, at the end of Two Gents, you have a contribution from Julia, who at the same sort of point reveals her identity. Had been dressed as Sebastian, now back to being Julia, and sort of almost equally uncomfortable is the fact that Julia seems perfectly happy to be kind of worked back into that kind of, you know, yeah. So the whole thing is, you know, it's a challenge, and it has been for a long time. What to do with a final scene that won't, the irony or the satire won't read. You know, it's I think my sense is that at the time, a strong element of what that final scene was is Shakespeare saying, is it not ridiculous that this exists as a kind of mythic idea, or a sort of chivalric folkloric notion? How absurd is this? And I think he is saying it's absurd, but I do think that's a challenge 400 years later, where we're not picking up the same cues that we might have been as his first audience.
Well, I think many of the work that you have explored, both the epistolary work in your previous book and the work in the most recent book, really do speak to the question of how significant and important this idea of the loving male relationship really was, and its complexities, but also its extension to social mentorship, social preferment, economic preferment in the Elizabethan world, which really does bring the play back to this question of Valentine and Proteus really as its animating center, and the Sylvia and Julia are almost pawns in some respects, despite the idea of their creating agency for themselves, which would not otherwise have been possible in their role as women in the play, and how strong.
Yeah, I don't know if I probably wouldn't go as far as to say pawns. I think there's certainly I think there are some performance challenges, I think, for both parts. Certainly from the point of view of naturalist or realist performance, or kind of character consistent performance that we'd favour today. And I think from in my reading, I think Julia really grows and develops as a character from that sort of those early scenes, which have a very sort of strong Portia and Nerissa vibe, where she's sort of, you know, weighing up her various suitors, to something, you know, extremely moving actually, when she adopts the persona of Sebastian and finds herself really emotionally torn apart by then, you know, experiencing the kind of the sort of Viola move, the kind of Viola from Twelfth Night move, where she's sort of working her, she finds herself in a weird emotional three-way that she didn't expect to be in. But I think you mentioned in your intro, Dan, the sort of the sense that you're getting at Shakespeare's first pass at the heroine dressed as a boy motif, which I think is absolutely right. Shakespeare takes quite a kind of leap with this one as well, because there's that wonderful moment when Julia as Sebastian is talking to Sylvia and sort of narrating her own grief through analogy about a performance that once upon a time Sebastian delivered as Ariadne, who was very unhappy because she'd been left abandoned by her lover, wearing Mistress Julia's gown So you've
Yes,
got this kind
yes,
of extraordinary sort of layering
yes,
of actual feeling covered by a sort of narrated feeling covered. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And really interestingly, also sets up lots of, for me anyway, questions about female performance. You know, we're very used to the idea that the all male early modern English stage. We're very used to the idea that adolescents and young men play female parts. We actually talk much less about women as performers in lots of other contexts, which were legion. You know, there were lots of places where women performed, not least in festive plays and the sort of residual mystery plays and things like that were still going on. So you know, for me, there's a real moment there of Shakespeare maybe allowing his audience to see an instance where someone like Julia, admittedly she's a fake person in an Italian play, but someone like Julia in an English setting could have performed. And so that speech that Julia as Sebastian is giving could also be, you know, Julia remembering herself a performance of, you know. So I love these kind of cultural sort of glimpses you get in the play of bits of Shakespeare's world that don't
yes.
always get a huge amount of attention nowadays. You know, we don't talk about those sorts of cultural contexts.
You know, that is a fascinating insight. I mean, because we do, and you're right. It's a serious deepening of our understanding of this. You know, we sort of look at this almost formulaically. You know, like an Elizabethan audience was accustomed to seeing a boy playing a girl playing a boy, and to handling that juxtaposition as ordinary. But the linkage to actual performance, and of course we do know, and as you correctly point out, that licenses were issued for mystery plays continuing, and particularly in rural areas, and that obviously was an important part of Shakespeare's own boyhood, was familiarity with local mystery plays, and the idea of women performers there is actually very interesting, a very resonant one in this context. And of course, the other part of the play, which is part of the genuine theatrical delight, is
You're
Speed
going to talk about the dog, aren't you?
I'm going there. I'm going there. It's Speed as the single most intelligent person on the stage, and Launce as by far one of the most attractive and fully engaged Shakespearean characterizations, with his deep love for Crab.
It's one of those things as well that I think it's Hugh James is a really, performance-wise, I think certainly in a UK context, and I think perhaps a bit different in the US, but it gets fewer stagings, I think, than you'd expect in the UK, and there are a couple of reasons for that, and I think one of them is final scene. I think one of them is a kind of general sort of air of condescension towards nerdy play, and I think one of them is the dog. And the either the expense and difficulty of having a dog, or that kind of slight discomfort with the distancing effect of some dog replacement, whether that's a puppet or a twin and dog zoo, or whatever you choose to do. Suddenly the play becomes something else.
Yes,
it becomes another choice. So all good. All of those options are good, but it just means you've got to go with it. It's got to be something that you really commit to.
No, go ahead. But the servants are such vivid, amazingly interesting pieces of this, and you're right. It's a wonderful point, Will, that you raised, that in fact the relationship of intimacy between the servant and the master, both ways, is actually, we tend to look at the servants, at Speed or Launce in a particularized way, as though they were a waiter in a restaurant who was approaching you. Whereas in fact, it's actually quite different. It's almost like a member of the extended family in some.
Oh, much more. And I think that's quite a lot of the humor, the sort of deliberate laugh out loud kind of funny lines humor, not all of which we still find funny, but that's certainly why the lines are there, are given to the two clowns, that characters, the two servants. And I think quite a lot of the humor, again, comes from a parodic place, because the servants are often either in their interactions with the two gentlemen, or their interactions with each other or with the dog, are burlesquing the kind of language and relationships that we're seeing in Valentine and Proteus, or indeed Valentine and Proteus and their girlfriends. So I think lots of those the sort of phrasings and kind of and sort of general sort of ranges of metaphor get a slip between them, in terms and they reappear in Speed and Lance's lines as a kind of pantomime burlesque undercutting, version, again suggesting that this play is working at a parodic and level,
Yes.
really ambitiously. It's not just the story is parodying certain kind of ideas of male friendship loyalty, but at a structural level, the different layers of characters are doing it as well, and doing it within the kind of infrastructure of the play.
Which is an extra, when you step back and think about that conception, then you realize how much, you realize that Dr. Johnson was completely right when he puts off those critics who had questioned whether Shakespeare was even the author by saying this is definitely Shakespeare. And it bespeaks, really a remarkable level of both intellect and sophistication, which is often missed in the sort of general animadversion about this as just an early patchwork effort.
And also, I think it's really indicative of our general unwillingness or lack of interest in thinking about what came before Shakespeare. So we sort of think, we say early Shakespeare, and we kind of go like, he's just emerging from the void. It's just sort of like, it's just the beginning of kind of him being a person. And actually, early Shakespeare is him bouncing off his own culture and bouncing off what came before and doing stuff with it in really cool and interesting and ambitious ways. And I think he's doing that with Two Gents. I think he's taking a particular sort of style of courtly comedy, and particularly rather sort of highly engineered patter and a highly engineered comic dialogue that we might, a few hundred years ago, we'd say it was Cowarddian or something like that. But sort of, he's drawing on playwrights like John Lilly, who were the decade or so before him, who innovated a whole sort of new form of kind of rather sort of elevated, ironic and comic dialogue that gets the label euphuistic. So John Lilly writes this prose fiction called Euphues, about someone who just speaks really well and kind of keeps sort of talking. And Shakespeare clearly is obsessed by that, because he does that with Mercutio. Later on in Much Ado About Nothing, that's what Beatrice and Benedict are doing. And Beatrice gets the mickey taken out of her by her friends. They tell her that she's too, and they kind of mock her for it. She's old-fashioned, Beatrice, by using that sort of style. But here, a few years earlier, Shakespeare's still kind of trying to do his version of it. So it's not him, it's not him being sort of young and ignorant. It's him being a relatively early career artist, riffing on what's gone before, and also riffing on what's been successful. What's worked, what have people liked, what can I do with that? How can I make this my own? How can I kind of turn this to my turn? And I think he does that by echoing the style really well. He's very good at it, but also putting in a dog pissing against a lady's dress, which is funny in whatever century you're in. And sort of bringing it down a peg. And I think that's an amazing thing for a young artist to do, is go, yeah, this is great, I can do it, but I can also slightly undercut it.
Yes, and and he's yes, and I love the fact that he's running these things in parallel. You know, he's running the you know the friendship between the loving friendship between the two protagonists. He's running the women and he's running the servants all at the same time to a remarkable end. Um, Although it is still, I wonder, you know, I'd be very curious, Will, to hear your thoughts about how the Elizabethan audience, this is pre-Globe actually, about how the pre-Globe audience would have responded to the final
Mm.
scene.
It's a really good question. I suspect Carla's going to suggest we turn to some audience questions. I've seen her appear on the screen
Yes,
magically.
yes. Oh, you're right. It is time. It is
Uh,
time.
That
Yes.
that
but
is
that's it.
yes, that is why. Yeah. Thank you. But what Dan was asking was something that I believe is one of the questions that folks have
Right.
sent in. Um, and how much would Shakespeare have been influenced by politics of his era, which you talked about, the influence of John Lilly and others, not politics, but artists of the era? Did he go along, rebel, or was subversive? And I
Mm.
think that's where you all are at. We'll have more. I have a couple more questions that were sent in, and there's one in the chat. But go ahead and answer that one question
Yeah.
with in
Well,
connection to Dan.
it's such a great question, and one of the interesting things about the many interesting things about this play is that we don't, other than a mention of it in 1598, it's listed as among the plays by Shakespeare. We don't have any performance records or indeed printings of the play until the first folio. And then there isn't really a performance history until the 18th century, when it is popular and it appears in various sort of adapted forms as well. And that final scene, as I was saying earlier, becomes something to either glide over and ignore or grapple with in some way pretty soon. I mean, I think Shakespeare is working in a conventional mode with that final scene. So there's the folkloric story that he's riffing on is a story about the noble friends called Titus and Gysippus, and it's a story that's retold in a extremely influential early Renaissance book by Thomas Eliot called the Book of the Governor, which is this sort of kind of very early sort of humanist text in English, and it's multiply reprinted, and lots of people know the stories that are collected in it. And Titus and Gysippus are best friends who, for various complicated plot reasons, end up one of them ends up taking the other person's place in the wedding night, and the story goes on, and then for other reasons, one of them ends up taking the other's place on the scaffold when one of them is threatened with execution for a different and unconnected. So, and the story is paralleling these acts of friendly self-sacrifice. So the notion of kind of passing in ways that are profoundly uncomfortable for today and have been for many years, passing a woman between two friends existed as a kind of concept, however problematically. So it's difficult to know. I think we would like to think that audiences, and certainly audiences of women, would kind of go like, no, nah, we're not having that, and that is not what we're having in our reigns. I suspect some of them would have done, but I think also some people, and probably some of the men, would have gone, yep, great, okay, yep, that seems normal, yep, no problems here.
Lifting up from the chat a question from Carolyn Renshaw, if time, wondering if either of you all have a viewpoint or more info on the development between Shakespeare's time and the Baroque era of pants roles in opera. Handel has several, meaning that a woman mezzo soprano sings the young male role. There's definitely a role written in Romeo et Juliet. I know as a fight person, that's my connection to that.
Yeah, and in Figaro, isn't there? There's wonderful role for a pants role. Yeah, look, the short answer is yes. I am such an ignoramus about music history that I wouldn't dare to go much further than that. But yes, and you certainly see you see sort of interesting developments in the restoration in England. So in the sort of 1660s, 1670s and on, when women actors are taken on by professional companies and do appear on the stages, uh, um, initially quite tentatively for the first couple of years, and then very soon, boy actors just move into history. The stage becomes mixed. But quite a lot of those earlier plays by Shakespeare and others that feature female characters dressed as boys remain very popular because they become an opportunity for women actors to, well, I mean, women actors to wear less restrictive clothing and costumes, but also to show off their legs. And that becomes a sort of part of the sort of allure of theatre and the kind of objectification of actresses that starts then and it's evidently continued. And it's a mode of objectification that the English stage, anyway, learnt from objectifying boys 40 years earlier. So there's definitely a sense that the forms that emerge in the 17th century and into the 18th century, and that would include opera, are learning from that sort of process of erotic titillation, or those processes of erotic titillation that developed in England generation earlier.
And of course this is coming back to our film. It's such a powerful motive force for Stoppard when he was doing the script to Shakespeare in Love, as well as is Gwyneth Paltrow wrestling with this, in the invented person of Violet de Lesseps. But
yes, I mean, interesting, very much a film of its time, and about the straightest way you could tell that story, I think. Yes. I would say, from on Stoppard's part and the other screenwriters. But the film just makes the occasional gesture towards acknowledging the great desire that's there, but not very bravely.
Yes, well, yes, yes, almost sub rosa, actually.
Yeah.
You all were touching on this earlier. I did put in the chat, but just letting everybody know, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will uplift them. Y'all were starting to explore some of the questions in this one was from a sent in one. Some called the show the original romantic comedy. How do you respond to that claim? This, I feel like this is our question, production-wise. How can the show be made relevant to a modern audience? How can this is also, I feel like, our question in terms of producing it. Y'all better show up in the parks and find out. How can anyone justify Proteus's behavior? And why would Julia ever forgive Proteus? And then this other question, is this the only instance of a pet played by a human actor in the canon? Well, you'll have to come and see the show, but we do not have an actor playing a pet on stage. And we also don't have a pet playing a pet on stage. So you'll have to come see what we do with it and let us know what your thoughts are. But going back to the original romantic comedy, that's quite a claim. What do you think?
It is, and I think it's very hard, I think, for us not to really want to put Shakespeare in the originary box, with more or less everything that he does. He's the sort of, the original love story, Romeo and Juliet, and the original political tragedy with the Scottish play and Julius Caesar. Like, yes, I mean, I think there's a real sense in which, so influential has he been, that there's merit in thinking about how he's sort of seeding so many sort of ideas that come after. But as I said before, he really isn't working in a vacuum. He isn't coming out of a void. He himself is responding to a very long history of culture of lots of different forms before him, and informing what comes after in lots of actually very complex and interesting and rather changeable ways. And Two Gents, again, doesn't spring fully formed from his brain. There are sources, identifiable sources, that he's drawing on. There's a Spanish romance that has that sort of provides the Julia into Sebastian line of the story. I've mentioned Titus and Gysippus already, which is a recognized source for that final scene. I mean, the Spanish prose romance, predates it by some time. There are lots and lots of very dramatic, if not actually drama, stories of romantic love that were very popular at the time, all of which could perhaps take the title of sort of the first kind of romantic comedy. So I would push back against Shakespeare being the one to kind of do it and do it first. But certainly I think because of his influence and because the fact that over the past 2 centuries, everyone in theatre, the entertainment industry, film industry knows their Shakespeare, or certainly did until very, very recently, those structures get baked into other forms of culture. So when we're looking back to, early screwball comedies or 1950s kind of romantic comedies or sitcom structures or whatever, you're seeing Shakespearean rhythms and structures because that's what the creators of those films and those shows knew. So in that sense, yes, he's very much that kind of originary figure. But I'd probably resist the idea of saying that he invented them in the first place.
It's one of the things that is, that when I always learn listening to you, Will, every time that we speak about these matters, and we are all so grateful for this. But I do want to pick up on something that Carla said, which is many of the points that Will has touched on are going to be very interestingly, and I will say brilliantly treated by our wonderful director, Eli Sonny Orquiza, and his wonderful assistant director, Katia Rivera, in the production that we're putting up this summer. And so, this is really as the Austrians would say, a Vorspeise for some very interesting theater decisions that are going to be made in this production. So this is one no one will want to miss when we get this up. And Will, we really have to figure out a way to get you over to see it, because it will.
I would love to. I'd love to. And I think in terms of Hannah's the rest of Hannah's question, I think you can't possibly justify Proteus's behavior, and why would you try to? And I think that's absolutely the kind of the offering, I think, for a modern production is jump off from that point. I mean, look, the play offers lots of interest, and I think I kind of love it for lots of reasons, but I don't think anyone likes it for that reason. So I think find something, and that's what directors do, and I'm sure Eli's doing a fabulous job, and I'm extremely bitter I can't see it. At least I can't see it live.
Speaking for myself as an artistic director and producer of this play, what excites me about this play is that it is not tied up in a bow for modern audiences, and that it is, for being an early play, this is incredibly complex for folks to understand. To me, it speaks very much to human friendships and the complexities that there are, and the relationships that all of these characters have with each other, is so exciting because it is rarely seen, y'all. So come on down, see it in the parks. It's 12:57 here, Pacific Standard Time. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but before we have any few moments left, any final thoughts? Again, please, thank you so much for everybody for joining us here during your time to let's talk about The Two Gentlemen of Verona with Dr. Will Tosh, who is absolutely fan favorite, my favorite. Thanks for coming in, and or one of my favorite, I should say, one of my favorites. So glad you're back again. If you enjoyed this content, please consider sending a donation to us in support of SF Shakes. at sfshakes.org/donate. And you can also catch this, tell friends. It will be on our YouTube channel as well as a link on our website, so you can catch that. Again, we have more coming up in August. We have a Let's Talk About It with Dan and our director, Eli Saniorquisa. And in September, Dan will talk to our 2 gents and 2 ladies to talk about their experience on the show. Our first stop is Cupertino, California. Then we're off to Redwood City, and then 2 locations in San Francisco. Again, we are free in the park. Bring your friends, bring your family, bring your picnic. So join us in the park.
And bring your dog. And bring your dog as well.
We are dog friendly. As long as your dog is on a leash, I believe, in the parks. Follow the parks guidelines. Dan,
I
Will,
just want to,
any other
Carla,
thoughts?
the one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we all give Will a wonderful internet hand and our thanks for, as always, a brilliant, insightful, and interesting set of comments on this play. And Will, you are, we're not letting go of you. We will be back next year.
Please don't.
with other shows as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
I really look forward to it. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure, Dan. Love, and thank you to Carla and to everyone else at Darling to be interviewed.
Terrific. Take care, everybody. Bye. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Will.